Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of The Hole on the Corner. I'm Dan Peterson, aka Dr. Rockter. And in this video, we are continuing our chapter by chapter overview of R.A. Lafferty's 1968 novel, Past Master. And we are at chapter 8, entitled Black Cathead. Cathead being all one word. And this continues my favorite portion of the novel that basically starts in chapter 6 when they start going through the feral regions on into the mountains in chapter 7, and then out of the mountains here into this giant slum city of horrors called Cathead in this chapter. And this is why I've often said that whilst at least previously Past Master didn't rate super highly for me amongst Lafferty's novels, it's always contained some of my most favorite moments in Lafferty's body of work. I mean, that said, these days, having reread it so many times and looking closely at it, it definitely goes up into my top 10 Lafferty novels at this point. And I'm curious, do other people rate Lafferty novels that way? Hardcore Lafferty fans out there, where do you rate his novels? Would Past Master make it into your top 10 or top 5? And feel free to share your top 10 or top 5 in the comments if you like, if we ever get that many hardcore fans commenting here. So the structure of this chapter is that Thomas has entered this city, and basically he gives reasons why he's staying here, visiting here. And then from there, as the chapter itself expresses it, it gives you kind of these two set pieces. And one is sort of a wide angle view of what's going on in the city, particularly around its sort of toxic industries and working conditions that are really terrible. And then this more close-up set piece that focuses on some particulars, most spectacularly something called Rat Castle, which we'll get to. And then this is one of those things I love going back through this novel, because there's so many little sort of formal or structural details that I forget about, because these certain things kind of wow you, and you're like, you remember that about the novel as a whole, about this chapter or what have you, and you forget all these other little elements that really help tie the whole thing together, and or kind of make it sort of radiate outward from its center, whether that's central themes or plot or what have you. And then these sort of circlings outward tend to then circle back as well and kind of reinforce central themes and plot and so on. And in this case, after these two compact set pieces, there are these like all similarly compact little philosophical dialogues, as a lot of the novel is made up of. And in this case, between Thomas and various characters, again, he speaks to Copperhead about a theme, and then he speaks to Rimrock about a theme, and then some of the Lungers, as the people who live in Cathead are called. And finally, this kind of lovely little set piece with essentially the Pope of Astrobe. And really nicely, in terms of the aesthetic shape of the chapter, it ends with one more very small, grotesque, and oddly moving little set piece about these conditions in the city. So that's the structure. And as I say, it's this nice little piece of art, this sort of collage or mosaic in its structure, just as a standalone chapter. So once again, the leaders are always trying to get hold of Thomas More, get hold of him, in terms of communication, but also get a hold on him and rein him in and get him under their sway, because they brought him here to essentially be a puppet president. He's like the strongest character in the novel, maybe the only real, truly novelistic character in the novel, although there's some contenders in the side characters with these nice sketches. But they send for him and they're like, come to us. And once again, he's recalcitrant and stubborn in an amusing way. And so what it says of Thomas is that he was, quote, proposed for the job of physician, and that as such he intended to examine the disease, at least superficially. So it's the same reason he went to the feral regions and the mountains, both of which are more or less proscribed to utopian citizens. He wants to examine these things firsthand. And in particular, this is like the heart of the so-called disease of utopia, which we'll see the nature of as we go through it. But this really gets to the heart of the issues here. And I have to admit, I'm going to say up front that I am still baffled by the central idea here. I keep thinking I kind of understand it, and then I think about it some more, and I'm like, I'm not sure I totally get this. So we'll get into that. But it is fascinating. It is a really interesting move in utopian dystopian literature. And it's really crunchy. It's really chewy, something you can get into. It's quite fascinating to me, and I'm curious what other people think. Maybe most people find it super straightforward and I'm just like overcomplicating it. Let me know what you think. And it says of him that he had been on Cathead's outskirts, and we saw that in some early chapters, and you get these little glimpses of real gross, weird stuff happening in the city and its sort of depraved conditions. And it says here, quote, "Now he had to study the sick giant itself, that mad thing that was eating into beautiful and rational Astrobe. He had to find out the riddle of this bleak monster city." So once again, we're dealing with monsters. You'll know that if you've been watching up till now, that, essentially this novel performs the role of haruspex, which is a term that it uses, of an augur or someone who divines meanings and so on from animal entrails, but it's looking at the entrails of monsters in various ways, including something like this city, which was described as the entrails of the planet laid out before them when they were way up on top of the mountain, could see down on this city and its contiguous cities, some of which are Cosmopolis, the key utopian city. And there in Past Master in particular, but really across Lafferty's body of work, there are monsters and there are monsters. They don't always signal just this or that, and certainly they don't always signal something objectionable, something evil. They can signal other kinds of excess or exorbitance or strangeness or just general category crisis, which is one of the key ideas in monster theory. This kind of stuff. And it comes from kind of the person who started monster theory, Jeffrey Cohen, said that monsters are harbingers of category crisis. And I disagree with a lot of what Cohen says in his original essay on the monster culture 7 theses. One of these days I'm going to write monster nature culture 7 antitheses, which I have a rough draft of, but who knows. But Cohen is super insightful about monsters. Don't get me wrong. He says some of the coolest and most staying stuff in that essay. The main one for me being this idea of category crisis. But there's other things I argue with him about. Never mind. We don't need to be talking about that. But the point is, in Lafferty, there's a multivalence of monstrosity. And there's sort of a range or spectrum of the monstrous. And I will say one more aside about this, something I wrote about in my PhD, that this connects to other sorts of monstrous imaginaries, to use that term from like social imaginaries or cultural imaginaries that some discourses talk about, just the given, accepted way that a culture imagines the world. And we do so with our monsters, and there's varying monstrous imaginaries amongst different cultures and so on. And I found more what I needed in terms of what monsters mean to read Lafferty. I found more of that in, for example, Native American ideas of the monster. And I wasn't able to get massively into this, but Japanese ideas of the monster, particularly in terms of yokai. But there's just this understanding that there's a range or a spectrum there that can go across from holy to evil and everything in between, or non, and that just has a really interesting diversity, multiplicity, variety. And you see that in Lafferty. And we'll see some interesting things about this city being called a monster in that regard, because it's monstrous in ways we would expect and understand that normally, and yet it is aligned with things that certainly Lafferty doesn't think of as monstrous in that more standard way of something sort of evil or malign. Apologies for getting too into theory for a second there. Anyway, on we go. So this chapter tells us that Cathead, which by the way is one of the coolest names of anything but for a city that I've ever heard. And we'll talk a little more about why it might be called that, because it is not spelled out at all. It tells us that Cathead is larger even than Cosmopolis, which again is the main utopian city, and that it had grown to its current size in the past 20 years, which is a recurring piece of information we're given, that all this like heightening of resistance to the utopia and problems from within it of various kinds has all accelerated just in these last couple of decades. And to me, the novel never is explicit of why that's the case or what's going on there. Let me know if you see something overt that explains that. But if not, then it leaves us with, well, are we supposed to like work that out? Why does that matter? Does that number matter? Why has it accelerated recently? And I don't know. But then Lafferty does one of my favorite things that he does. You just get used to these quirks and you appreciate them. But he just makes this really plain, simple statement that to me, and he does this from time to time, almost sounds like a note that you would write to yourself as a novelist there in your text to come back to and rewrite. And he just says, of Cathead, it was human misery on the largest scale ever known anywhere. I mean, again, to point to how people have joked that Lafferty just completely ignores the rule of show, don't tell, and instead just tells instead of showing. However, he is going to show us. But in terms of writing it and evoking it initially, there's other more novelistic, or what we think of as novelistic, ways you could have approached that, but he just says it like that. And it's almost an exaggeration. I mean, like, it's like maximum, largest scale ever known anywhere. And like the good tall tale raconteur that Lafferty is, he's going to make good on this boast, as we'll see. And as I mentioned, in terms of the structure, the narrator is going to sort of demonstrate this claim or cash it out with these two approaches of sort of a wide angle and close up. And so he begins by saying, take it from the outside and in general. And from there, he begins by describing briefly how the city is involved with and or contiguous with these various bodies of water. And water is one of the main recurring motifs and images in the novel that carries a lot of thematic weight. So it's a coastal city, so it's on the sea, and it also has several major canals in it. And then it says of it that, quote, it had 100 navigation channels. It was astride all the lines of civilized Astrobe like a huge spider. And that was an image also, like it being called a monster, it was also likened to a giant spider in the previous chapter when they viewed it from way up on the mountain. So that's reiterated. And since the rest of the chapter doesn't go into that imagery anymore, I want to say here that I actually was never struck by this before. This is really right out there, and I just didn't see this parallel. But Cosmos Kingmaker, who is one of the three sort of oligarchical, semi-secret rulers of Astrobe, who brought Thomas More to this future time, when Paul and More encounter Kingmaker and the other rulers in the Hop equation space rapid dreams that they have, so sort of dreams in hyperspace, each of them is given each of them is evoked through a sort of heraldic animal image, which was set up like within the first couple of words of the novel. Peter Proctor is a fox, Fabian Foreman is a hawk or an eagle, and Cosmos Kingmaker is a lion. But in the dream passage, he's a spider with a lion's head, which is really cool. And he has this thing where he's going, do not rumble my webs, oh, do not rumble my webs. Now what we have here is a city called Cathead that is likened to a giant spider. We have another lion-headed spider. Now, I think the immediate interpretation that might suggest itself there is that, oh, okay, so this city is connected to Cosmos Kingmaker. It represents him somehow. But no, not at all. It's Cosmopolis, the main utopian city that is associated with Cosmos Kingmaker and everything he's all about. And it's, this is often called the golden dream of Utopia, the golden dream of Astrobe. And I believe somewhere in here, the webs themselves are called golden. I can't remember for sure. But the color gold is associated with the lion-headed spider that is Cosmos Kingmaker and all that he represents. But here we have a black spider and a black cathead, as the chapter is called. So a very different color, and as we'll see, associated with the blackness of toxic industry and so on, whereas the gold is associated with the sort of paradise and wealth and glory of utopian life. So it seems to me what we have here is a counter image, an anti-utopian lion-headed black spider. And if you think in Lafferty's terms of lions, as often as not, this is like literally throughout his fiction, when he refers to a lion, as often as not, he's referring to North American lions, i.e., pumas and other associated types of, North America's version of big cats, which are, have traditionally been called panthers as well in the States, though they're not what we think of as the panther usually from other parts of the world. And yet here, given its blackness, it can have that association too. So you can almost picture two different kinds of lion-headed spiders. The classic, either a sort of golden colored puma lion, or perhaps the lion with the mane and so on, that Cosmos represents, which would be the most natural way to think of him. And then you have over here this like Black Panther sort of headed black spider that is this horrible city. And I think, as we'll see, this fits thematically with the chapter and what it's doing. So yeah, let me know what you think about that. I'm just like blown away by this. That is such an interesting aesthetic sort of pictorial move there. That's very cool. So what we're told here is that Cathead's industries were, quote, not hidden and disguised like the industries of the golden cities. It was an angry town built out of extreme poverty, with all commodities produced at a much greater real expense than in any of the golden cities. And so you see here this, that association of the color gold with the utopian project. And it's not that Cathead and slum cities are doing a bunch of work. People are, being forced to work there in order for other people to live in luxury. It'll make that clear in a moment. That is not what's happening here. But it is pointing out a contrast that the industries in the golden cities are hidden. I guess that's part of the utopian dream, is that you don't have to see that stuff's even happening to make all your commodities. And also that whatever expense towards people's lives that does have over in the golden city, which the novel does not get into, it's way more costly in human life and suffering over here in this city, Cathead. So even though these two cities aren't connected in their industries, thematically, Cathead does seem to expose what the utopian cities hide, and as we'll see, it does so vividly and repulsively. So it says here explicitly, quote, Cathead produced nothing that was not produced elsewhere in Astrobe, nothing that was not already present in abundance. So, and it's going to reiterate this, there's just no need for all this massive industry. So already I think it's pressing into kind of strange utopian dystopian territory. And I think it goes with Lafferty's sort of tall tale approach here to like push things to an extreme, to make his point really loudly and boldly. And I'm very much reminded of Flannery O'Connor's famous saying about using the Gothic and the grotesque to communicate like Lafferty, spiritual, theological ideas and values, and or just, social critique or anything you want to say as an artist. One of the ways to do that is through the grotesque. And what O'Connor said was, when you can assume that your audience holds the same beliefs as you do, you can relax a little and use more normal means of talking to it. When you have to assume that it does not, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing, you shout, and for the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures. And while I've always felt resonances between these American Catholic authors, O'Connor and Lafferty, I've begun to draw those parallels more and more, and particularly this strategy that O'Connor had. I'm like, this is Lafferty's exact strategy. He is writing to people he thinks don't share his understanding of the world, theologically especially. And by and large, I would say that's correct, especially within sort of science fiction and new wave science fiction and other aspects of culture. He's not writing for fellow Catholics. He's writing for those who really don't have that framework. And, you make what you want of that strategy. Like, I don't know what I think. I mean, I think it's an interesting and fun strategy, whether it's as needed as they say, and or that's the best approach to reach across belief systems to get attention, or the only approach. I don't know. I'd have to think more about that, but certainly that's what they do, and it certainly makes for extremely spicy literature in both authors, as they are both well known for being grotesque, weird, shocking, ornery, really, cantankerous, and your mileage may vary, as they say, and aspects of it may work better than others for various audiences. But I do, I like the weird, and I like some slam bang for my buck. So, I do appreciate it on the aesthetic level, and I kind of have mixed feelings about it on the ideological level. But Lafferty is definitely using shout and shock in this chapter in particular, and in this idea in particular of just people fleeing utopia to go do this extreme of useless suffering, and that's what it is will be spelled out momentarily. It mentions that because of all this water in the sea and so on, that it does that marine mining was a major aspect in general of the planet's industries, we're told. Like, that's just a major thing on this planet. And this is in part because it says, quote, the astrolabe seas were vast chemical vats, sharper than the seas of Earth. Interesting, and I'm not sure if there's more going on in the novel with that, but that's a nice little science fictional touch. But it points out that the marine mining done in other cities, in the utopian cities and so on, was done, quote, without the repulsiveness of the processes of Cathead. So everything being done here is already being done somewhere else in less toxic or perhaps just non-toxic conditions. It says further that, quote, manufacturing techniques in Cathead were archaic, inhuman, and very expensive if human years and lives were counted in the costs. And it says that they were deadly. It says there were cheap, clean processes elsewhere. And it says that, quote, people died like day flies in these industries, and they lived miserably while they lived. And there was no need of Cathead at all. So here we have the very humans themselves likened to flies with a short-lived span of life due to these conditions. So here we're told something very important about this whole situation. In spite of the fact that this is just completely unnecessary and it's way more harsh than it needs to be, we're told, but some millions of citizens had left the golden cities of Astrobe, had refused advice, had defied threats, had climbed barricades in more recent years, and run the gauntlet of gunfire to get out of the pleasant golden cities and into bleak Cathead, to suffer there and to die there. And the lives they left for this were the most pleasant lives that men and machines had yet been able to devise. It seemed a poor trade. This was the riddle of Cathead and the sickness of Astrobe. So there it is. People are fleeing the, as people say, post-scarcity conditions of these utopian cities. And, the enjoyment of these luxuries of the utopian cities is obviously enforced by a police state, as we've seen throughout with mechanical killers and so on. But you're not even allowed to leave it. And this is something I didn't much notice in earlier reads of the novel. Not only are you not allowed to think against it, or you'll be under threat of the mechanical killers, but you're actually not allowed to leave the utopian cities, at least not to go into a place like Cathead. But people wanted so badly out of these utopian cities that they would just like climb over barricades and risk getting shot. And in subsequent chapters, we're going to see in a little more detail some of the things that I think most of us would find objectionable about these utopian cities. But in terms of it being a level of wealth and physical comfort and so on, I think the novel expresses that actually is the case. It's not that it's not as nice as it seems. No, it's like it's at least on the level of say housing and clothing and food, and I'm not sure what else, but it's everything you could hope for. I mean, such that it really is baffling to people who aren't fleeing, and to Thomas, as we'll see, like, why would you do this? Why would you leave that for this? It seems a poor trade, as it says. And this is the riddle. This is like, what's going on here? It's the sickness of Astrobe that people would leave that utopian ideal for this, not just less than ideal, but like the opposite of it, like absolute horror. And again, this is written, I think, more and more, and I need to reread Utopia for starters, but some other sort of imaginative travel literature. I think that's what a lot of these sort of summary, compact portions of the novel read like. It's one of the many sort of forms or modes that Lafferty folds into this multi-genre sort of novel. And what he's just described, most, I think, dystopian novelists would have, first of all, they would have introduced us into various characters that we would become very invested in, and built the world up slowly all around that, and we would have watched them slowly but surely come to the place where they want to escape, or just, would have seen them bit by bit in the sort of daring adventures of trying to get out and so on. And probably more toward the beginning of the novel. And Lafferty just like brings this in super late in the novel and just in a super summary way. And I'm going to say a little more about that and why I think it works as form in a minute. But in terms of this being the riddle of this novel, I do find it a riddle. And I've always found it to be one of the, again, sort of crunchiest like enigmas of this novel. From the very first time I read it, it always really struck me. And as I say, I sort of think I get it, but then I'm not so sure. And I have to say, as someone who has lived in less than ideal conditions for my entire life, coming from a quote unquote lower class, and, having lived in a lot of very relatively impoverished conditions, I am inclined to see, the problem there being a system that creates these kind of conditions for, millions or more people, and that imagining and working for better systems and structures and societies that mitigate and seek to do away with, these inequalities and bring about the reverse, a justice and equality for all. It is, it's quite an imaginative leap for me to imagine a system that's so perfect in certain kinds of material conditions that you would seek out something deprived and depraved, as we're about to see this city really truly is. But there's ways in which I can definitely see Lafferty's point, and we'll get to that as well. But again, here, what we're being told is that these are not conditions that are enforced on these people. And these conditions are even called explicitly here slavery, but that they've voluntarily entered. It's like in an industrial workforce sort of slavery. In fact, it was, the so-called good conditions of utopia that were the enforced aspect of things, and they're choosing this instead. And it even reiterates for us quite clearly here that these people who lived here in Cathead were, quote, low, poor people who could be high, rich people by sundown tonight if they wished. And, I would wish that for myself by sundown tonight, but I can imagine it being under other types of conditions that would not make it worth it. So, not just at any cost would even I, quote, people who are in more impoverished conditions, wouldn't necessarily choose better conditions under any circumstances. And I'm curious again what readers think of this. Does this speak to our moment? Is there something about even those who are experiencing the better qualities of this society? Is there something about just AI and algorithm and social media and streaming and food delivery and all the rest of it that is, in a sense, a sort of utopia that just isn't worth it? And that we might even seek worse material conditions if they made the spiritual reality somehow better. And by spiritual, you could read that any way you want, but meaning something about our minds, our hearts, our inner lives, and so on. And is what Lafferty's doing here, is this profound? Or is it silly? Or is it a bit of both? I mean, to the degree that it is a profound idea of imagining a utopia that you would flee into these terrible conditions to get away from, I do think it's silly. It's exaggerated, like massively exaggerated, again, as we're about to see. And in that sense is silly, but for the purposes of making at least an allegedly profound, statement about these things. And so as we go into some long descriptions of this that I'll quote here, I just want to say that the way I made a big deal about the sort of, for Lafferty, the lengthier landscape descriptions in previous chapters, here we get that similar kind of descriptive quality, but of an urban setting, in a particularly disturbing one. So here's how he begins this first, getting into the details of this first set piece. They went out in the sea harvest boats that made old-fashioned garbage scows seem like dream ships. They worked 20 hours a day on the noisome sea, and 3 years of such work would kill the strongest. But the Golden Cities had automatic sea harvesters. The slag workers in Cathead lost all their coordination. They stuttered and slobbered and could not speak or think straight. The gel miners coughed up blood by the bucketful and went insane at the work within 18 months. The extractors of oxypyrites had the most terrible labor of all, absolutely killing. And the curiosity of this is that there was no market or use for the product, no pay for the work, no reward of any kind. Men borrowed and begged and sold their children for food and went to the non-paying labor that maimed and killed. They turned blue and went mad from it. The product was piled up useless and poisonous, and the corpses that were the byproduct were piled nearly as high. And yet more than 500,000 men, women, and children worked their 20 hours a day extracting oxypyrites and wagered whether starvation or the poison would kill them first. So yeah, there you go. I mean, he's just going all out with this. Like, they're not even being paid for this work. It serves no purpose. It's toxic what they create, and it just sits there polluting everything. And there's that gallows humor in there where they just make bets on whether people starve to death first or die from poison. And I would love to hear somebody kind of dig into the sort of industrial material processes going on here and say a little more about that and what Lafferty might be working with here, because Lafferty was had training as an electrical engineer and evidences in a lot of his work and understanding of various sort of industrial and other sorts of material labor and processes and so on. He's often quite interested in like construction and construction materials and these sorts of things. So what's he doing here with all that? But regardless, it seems that the point of Cathead is just to cause the most extreme suffering possible as some kind of counteraction or antidote to utopia. It seems. Tell me how you interpret this. It seems as if just getting out of the utopian cities is nowhere near enough. I don't know if it has some kind of permanent mental impact on people who have lived in utopia, but it's as if nothing less than this kind of intense, chosen, pointless suffering will do to sort of wake up your soul from being devoured by utopia, and indeed devoured by Udin, the nothingness monster that is behind utopia, as we've seen previously with Udin using the very language of devouring. It's like that spiritual, mental nothing is just implanted so deep within people who have lived in utopia that somehow this kind of thing counteracts it. Whatever you make of this, ideologically, narratively, artistically, to what degree you think it works or doesn't work, or makes a point or doesn't make a point, to me, it's arresting. It's just interesting. It's like, that is an interesting move to make. And I think it's part of why, as I mentioned before, Samuel Delany says that he in particular, and Le Guin in particular, had read the proofs of Past Master and felt that Lafferty kind of launched the sort of current from that time new run at utopia and dystopia, and that they each felt a need to respond with Le Guin's Dispossessed and Delany's Trouble on Triton, the latter of which I still haven't read. And I think there's a lot of things going on in this novel that might have been a provocation for them, but I think this is one of the key aspects. This whole idea of just like hating utopia so much that you don't just like run away from it, you don't even attack it, blah blah blah. You just like get out of it into its exact opposite. That is just, and it's very Lafferty, just that's so cranky, sort of at odds and odd. And just this, I don't know, to me, fruitfully, diametrically opposed sort of counter move that I think, whether you agree with it or not, just like shakes things up and gets the discussion going, and makes great writers and thinkers say, I want to say something about this too. And in that sense, I think Lafferty's Past Master is a great work, and I think continues to be a provocation in that way. And there is much about Lafferty's orientation that I personally feel, in all honesty, some antipathy toward. And I think you could approach him from complete antipathy to his work and find it fruitfully provocative and even interesting and enjoyable at the fictional level, the artistic level. Whereas I think that I do sympathize with some of the things that Lafferty seems to have at his core and center that to me are in contradiction to other things at his core and center. So there's a lot to work with in a provocation like Past Master. So from this wide angle, it comes in the close-up, and in the language of the novel, it says, take it from the inside, and in particular. And here's one of the standout scenes of the novel, to me, up there with when they hunt the devilfish or when they're in hop equation space. We have Rat Castle. Are you ready? Here we go. Take the Rat Castle. This was 35 stories high and 150 meters on a side. Once 25,000 people had lived closely crowded in it. Now there were perhaps some remnants of those 25,000 skeletons, and there were 1 billion rats. They covered the outside so that the color of the old building could not be told. They throbbed inside in carpets a meter deep and covered the walls like live paper. They raided out from the rat castle, killing and eating children by the thousands, killing women, killing grown men, covering them in a devouring cloak and shrinking them down to bones. They went right through wooden buildings. They ate mortar as though it were cheese, and weakened and entered and toppled brick structures. They ate 3,000 people alive every day in Cathead. There were upwards of 100 other tenements in Cathead taken over completely by rats, but none of the magnitude of the rat castle itself. Come on. That is some kind of description there. A live paper, I love that phrase. Carpets of rats on the walls like live paper. And just like devouring people, shrinking them down to bones. If you've read Rats by James Herbert, there's a strong parallel there. And here we just have it evoked in a second, but so effectively. And there is, and it again, I really think this is, in the tall tale tradition. And therefore, there's a cartoon-like quality, to me, in a very good way that we've seen elsewhere in the novel as well. And again, it's like that gross out sort of cartoon type thing. But to the degree that this portion is in that sort of travel literature summary sort of mode, you just imagine reading, a little bit of travel literature about this place, and it's describing all these things, and it's like, oh, this place is the worst, and then like people are devoured by rats and so on. Or indeed like old school travel literature, which is, really what it's inspired by, like Thomas More's Utopia. Instead of describing here's where they went to work and what they did for leisure and how the government worked and so on, it's like there was all this disgusting poisonous industry and everybody was dying and people were devoured by rats in an instant and so on. As an aside, I would love to write about rat horror in Lafferty at some point, because this is not the only place it comes up. He has certain animals that almost exclusively get a bad rap because of the way he uses them sort of symbolically and so on, and rats are one of them. However, as with others, spiders, snakes, and rats often are used as symbols of evil or things out of balance and so on in Lafferty's writing. However, in each case, you will find a little piece here and there where they're used basically in an opposite register. There's a very sympathetic or empathetic portrayal of them. In this case, I would point to a really, really wonderful, strange little story called Fog in His Throat that was collected by Ramsey Campbell in a I think 79 collection called Super Horror, that has a beautifully sympathetic portrayal of rodents in this really strange key. And despite these rats going around eating people and indeed eating corpses, we're told that the reason why there are still hundreds of corpses in the streets at all times is because those are the corpses that are too poisonous even for the rats to eat. And this gives me occasion to again say that like scenes like this and like the devilfish and so on previously are more instances of the kind of vividly grotesque and spectacular sort of writing that Lafferty does here and there that is almost completely missing from the best of R.A. Lafferty. There's a little bit of that in here, but not nearly enough to be truly representative of what you're going to encounter in his work, and which is why you need stories like Snuffles in particular, and some others, to do that aspect of Lafferty justice, and to give you a genuine flavor of what all's going on in his work. And it's not always just horror. There are other ways in which his work has teeth and just a more visceral aspect to things. And there is some of that in here, mainly in the last couple of stories, which I really wonder if people ever get through to the end, to some of the best stuff toward the end, because to me it's front loaded with a lot of, in some ways, more average stories for Lafferty. And those stories are usually much better than they might seem on a first go. They're quite literarily rich, but I think they're better served really peppered throughout a greater variety of what he does. That said, it also points to the fact that why I defend his novels so much, you are going to get a lot more of Lafferty's strangeness or viscerality and horror, or a lot just more of what he does at its most extreme and most potent in the novels than you will ever get in the short stories, which is why if you really like Lafferty, I really encourage you to make your way through the novels. They're worth it, despite the sometimes bad reputation that they get. They are different. They're not going to be novels in the way that you normally expect them to be, at least in certain respects. But for whatever, drawbacks, if you want to call them that, they have counterbalancing qualities that you just kind of can't get elsewhere. And we're told mercifully briefly of sadists' dives that people sell their children into, and that the devil himself was seen running from these retching. Enough said about that. Ugh. And I will say that's a part of this aspect of this counter response to utopia that I don't totally get. If there's a price you won't pay to be in the good physical conditions of utopia, it would seem there's an equal price you wouldn't pay to be in its counteraction over in like Cathead, because it's repeated that people sell their children for money and so on. And that people are willingly entering into conditions. I don't think it's that they gladly do that, but they're going into conditions that are going to make them so, I guess, hungry and possibly, mentally disturbed and so on, that they would do things like that in addition to everything else going on. And that seems, obviously like too high a price to pay. It's like, I know you're stuck between these two things, but that aspect of things is just not dealt with. And I think that's Lafferty just, pushing it so hard to make this like, you think, there's literally nothing worse than utopia on those terms, on those spiritually empty terms. And yeah, I don't agree with Lafferty there. This is just as bad or worse, that aspect of these Cathead and cities like that. So let me know what you think, how you read that. What were your impressions there? I might be missing something here, but we're told that there's like a trade in eating rats to sort of like eat them before they eat you sort of thing. And that there's a sort of regular yellow flag day where the plague keeps returning, and while the flag's up, it's happening, and then it runs its course and they take the flag down. And we're told that people refuse inoculation against the plague. So again, just that extreme, like, we will suffer the worst at any cost to counteract utopia. Very strange. And I love this little bit here about the name of the sort of quote unquote insane asylum. It doesn't use those terms, but it's called Bethlehem, which I believe has, been the name of historically of places like that. Bethlehem. There's like a Bethlehem Bedlam association going on there, equivalents, which is fascinating. And I'm not going to get into it here, but it says of that it started as a madhouse, and then it grew to a mad farm, and eventually became a mad district of Cathead. So, I mean, the whole city is just like this horror city, but even a portion of it is more so. It's like this, madhouse district. I'm reminded of, I don't know much about this lore, but things in the Batman sort of lore and so on. I think that something like that happens, Arkham and what have you. And, I just got to say that in its really compact form, there is like, like Blood Meridian level horrors going on in Lafferty and Lafferty's novel Past Master. And, like Cormac McCarthy, like Gene Wolfe and others, Lafferty is one of those writers that you probably just can't effectively adapt to screen. You would just water it down. It just wouldn't be what it is on the page. That said, as with most of these other authors, for fans of him, most of us want to see somebody try, even though we'll just complain about how bad it is. And I could see the right kind of people just really doing something with like this city scene and stuff. I think something like Past Master would work better probably if you could get like a really strong budget for it as like a limited series, a TV series, more so than a film. But you would need like film level special effects and so on, tastefully done, artfully done. But it tells us that quote unquote extreme suffering, I mean it spells out in those words, is just it's just baked into this city. It's kind of what it's all about. And I guess, mostly Walter Copperhead of Thomas's retinue, who is the Haruspex of the crew, so that makes sense that he would be the one, is the one kind of touring him around the city. And Thomas asks Walter Copperhead, why bodies are just left laying about and not buried. And Copperhead says of the unburied bodies that they are, quote, a reminder of death. Follow it out far enough, and it becomes a reminder of life. And that, I think, is in general what's going on in this city all around. Like, press into the darkness, the suffering, and so on, and it will lead you to its opposite. And its opposite is not, according to Lafferty, the utopian dream. It's not really stated what it is, but life, real life, can be found more through this kind of bleakness, this bleak monster city, than it can be in the golden cities of utopia. Now, one of Thomas's problems here as forthcoming world president is that it's not just that this exists, this is happening. It's that it's spreading. He says, but it spreads. More leave the world of perfection and join the misery every day. And Copperhead says, better a life of misery than no life at all. And so again, you have this stark contrast, like golden utopia, all your needs met physically in that way, but at the cost of basically your soul, is no life at all. And even this extreme suffering at least is actual life somehow. Whether you agree with that or not, that's, sort of the stark contrast that's being put up here. And again, it's like kind of ridiculous, and I've said before, it's like almost a straw man and stuff, but it presses so hard into that it starts to kind of work. And if you want to think of it as a straw man, it's like Lafferty has created a scarecrow. Which end is the scarecrow? I guess the bleak monster city, but the straw man is I don't know. Never mind. Anyway, he set up this contrast that is kind of so ridiculous and so black and white that it's provocative and it makes you think. And I think it actually, by Lafferty's intention, makes you think about the nuances through a lack of nuance. And Lafferty was a huge fan of Chesterton, and Chesterton was all about paradox, so it wouldn't be surprising to find Lafferty being paradoxical in that way. And when Thomas asks Walter Copperhead, and then he asks some of the Lungers that we've seen before, Battersea and Shanty, why are people doing this? Why would anybody choose this over utopia? In both instances, they just laugh at him. And I guess, it's just like a if you have to ask sort of response. Like, if I have to explain it to you, just never mind, buddy. I don't know. Again, just that over exaggerated, contrast. So again, he wants to just kind of like leave these people to this self-chosen sort of damnation, I think, as he calls it. Yet again, as it says, he says, quote, but it spreads. It's eating up the world. I swear that when I come into my power, I will raise every brick and stone of this place and destroy every unreconstructed being here. And this isn't the first time, actually, that Thomas has suggested sort of a genocide of non-utopians. But this monster city, this giant cat-headed spider city, is eating up utopia. And again, okay, I'm going to be honest, this is actually hitting me as I say this. This fits into the counteracting image here that we have of golden lion-headed spider, Cosmos Kingmaker and his city Cosmopolis. Over here you've got black Cathead, the black, dark, panther-headed spider. And behind the golden utopia, we're shown Udin the nothingness monster, and Udin himself expresses that he is here to eat everything up, to eat up souls, to eat up the world, and the counteracting image here, through this extreme suffering, somehow this is meant to eat up the golden utopia, eat up the nothingness so that it can't eat up everything else. Basically, it devours the devourer. Again, paradoxical, interesting. Yeah, just a fascinating move. Something's eating up the world. Eat that thing up. Swallow it. And there probably is some conscious thought here on Lafferty's part of imagery of Christ as a lion in the New Testament. And I will say again, something that's hitting me as I'm talking about this. Wow, there's a lot going on here. This is something I used to think about a lot. A good example of sometimes, so one of the, theology, right? People interpret the Bible, right? And many people have interpreted the Bible in these really black and white ways. And people think that, with a doctrine that the Bible is the Word of God, right? You would think that it's going to be crystal clear and, set out some really plain stuff. And maybe it does in certain respects. But many would think that a sacred scripture can't contain, ambiguity, but in fact, the Bible is filled with ambiguity. I mean, to the degree that one term can mean almost opposite things, depending on context and so on. And one of the images that I always thought of that was pretty stark to me was the image of the lion in the Bible. The lion is figured both as Satan and as Jesus. Jesus is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and Satan is called a lion roaming about, seeking whom he may devour. Oh, maybe Lafferty's working with that imagery here. It's like, how did I miss that before? So yeah, he's got the utopian sort of satanic lion devouring everything, who, it's also said in the Bible that Satan comes as an angel of light, the golden city and so on. And he's got, but being Lafferty, he doesn't just like have this like lion of the tribe of Judah, beautiful sort of Aslan like counter image, like from Narnia and stuff. He's got this dark lion over here. And of course, both lions are actually lion-headed spiders. It's got to be weird for Lafferty. But, going in that dark imagery there for the counter lion, as it were, is, fits with certain biblical themes of Christ through his sacrifice entering into darkness, becoming sin. It even says, in one part, there's imagery of Christ kind of becoming a serpent on the cross, and that's kind of implied in there in different things. I mean, that's there. You can go look it up. You don't have to take my word for it, but and as I've mentioned before, I talk a little bit in, I think, chapter 4 of my PhD thesis about Lafferty's picture of the Christo monstrous, particularly in the story Boomer Flats, which is a place you wouldn't exactly expect it, but it's really in there. And then it connects over to some Christo monstrous imagery in Serpent's Egg, a later novel, which connects very strongly to Past Master and is almost like a development of certain themes in Past Master. And I'm not sure how much there is biblical or theological imagery of the divine devouring evil. That might be in there. I'm not exactly sure, but that seems to be something of what Lafferty is getting at here, whether he's drawing on some kind of tradition or source or is being innovative there. But it's certain that does indeed, I think, connect, yes, to language that C.S. Lewis uses of the lion Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia. And so, like I said, in one way, you don't have this big shining Aslan figure here, but in another way, you have him like coming in through this dark imagery. And Lewis, explicitly uses devouring imagery of Aslan devouring really kind of all things in a sort of benevolent way. And Lafferty here sees, certainly this counteraction of suffering in Cathead being a way to devour the nothingness, the evil of utopia. So this is all coming to me as I say it. Maybe it seems pretty kind of tangled up to me, so forgive me that. But maybe it doesn't sound any more tangled than the things I planned to say. But I think there's something here. I hope people will riff on it, work with it, talk to me about it. But speaking of sort of tangled things, from these sort of big pictures, big but compact pictures of this city, we've moved into a few little exchanges with Copperhead and Battersea and Shanty. And now we're going to move into a section with Rimrock. And for me, this and a few other sections in this chapter are these really nice little novelistic scenes. And again, I want to reiterate, that is why I think this novel in particular, and really most of Lafferty's novels in this way, are, formally kind of baffling, because he just moves in and out of these different sort of modes and forms and genres. And he does it swiftly, but not necessarily seamlessly. In fact, I would say he does it seamfully. And I've mentioned before that people talk about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein being akin to the creature itself, in that the novel itself is visibly stitched together from all these disparate forms and modes and so on. And I think that's just generally how Lafferty writes. Lafferty writes Frankenstein novels. And you see that here as in this abrupt shift. And your mind has to go from like one kind of presentation to another in an instant. And, again, I think different readers will find that exciting or not. I think sometimes it works artistically better than others, but always I find it pretty thrilling and exciting. It's a bumpy ride, but it gives it to me, a sort of punk edge, or whatever you want to call it, whatever your frame of reference is for something a little more experimental or quote unquote edgy or whatever. But it works with, discord or noise, or I don't know, a certain level of controlled chaos or what have you. And in that regard, I actually think it's worth mentioning. I recently started to read the introduction to The Big Book of Science Fiction by Jeff and Anne Vandermeer, and they go into kind of a history of science fiction and go over some of the things that people have claimed, like where does science fiction come from? And people have said it, famously Brian Aldiss says it comes from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and others have followed suit, and I find that pretty convincing. But there's other, there's the early pulp stuff, and there's H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, or I don't know how to say that the French way, and various sorts of sources. But one I had never, I actually think I had seen this somewhere, but I completely forgotten it. But one that they bring up that I have almost never seen, maybe never, that the Vandermeers bring up is this sort of Kant philosophique, or Kante philosophique, I can't say it. Anyway, some kind of French term. French? Yes. For a philosophical story, or a fable of reason, I guess it's sometimes translated, that various writers, Voltaire and Kepler and others apparently used. And it's a way of kind of doing a little narrative to make a philosophical point, perhaps a scientific point, and so on, that doesn't follow the same kind of rules as short story writing or novels and so on. And the Vandermeers reckon some science fiction is really drawing on that as much as other things, and that's what gives science fiction some of its variety of approaches. And that Kant philosophique can also relate to myth and fairy tale, which is made my ears perk up in relation to Lafferty, because I think Lafferty is often just like fusing philosophy, fairy tale, myth, and contemporary fiction ideas, and playing around with science fiction itself and so on. So I think we have some of that mode going on in a novel like Past Master, weaving in and out of other things. So it says that Thomas looked up Rimrock on purpose, that his was a mind he respected, and it says that he found him tired from 3 days diving in a fantan parlor where the Ansells went to be fleeced. And I absolutely love the consistency here with what we've already heard about Ansells in general and Rimrock, and it points to, again, how I've said many times that what he does is he sketches a character or a part of the world building, and then he just puts in another little piece here and there to kind of reinforce it, maybe build it up. And I just think it's really effective. And I have increasingly found the portrait of Ansels on all possible levels, on their sheer sort of alienness, on their sort of biological aspect, on their spiritual aspect, and on the material conditions that they live in, all just so interesting and moving. I really think Ansels deserve a minor place in the pantheon of, science fiction aliens. They're really interesting. But we'd been told before that aside from being used as sort of communication centers because of their telepathy or eutheopathy, as the novel puts it, that their main job tends to be as underwater welders in toxic conditions, which they're such beautiful species inside and out that it's quite moving to see them in those conditions. And that what they liked to do in their time off was play this Chinese gambling game called Fantan. And, here we have, Rimrock's tired. He's been diving for 3 days. He just wants to gamble in his off time. Just love that. Again, I would actually love to see this attempted on screen. I mean, I can't imagine anybody doing Rimrock well enough because he's shape-shifting is on top of everything else. But again, I think somebody like Del Toro or somebody Del Toro inspired could maybe pull it off. But yeah, I'd love to see a series of this kind of thing. And Rimrock says that he goes around like preaching Thomas to it says other creatures of, it says he goes around preaching Thomas to humans, Ansels, and other creatures of Cathead. So I don't think this is developed elsewhere in the novel, but maybe there's other beings here aside from humans and Ansels, which would make sense because on a lot of Lafferty's other planets, mainly in the short stories, but in some of the novels, there are other sorts of species than humans here and there. They're usually only lightly touched on, but sometimes more so. But their conversation leads into this little, very important philosophical piece in the novel, philosophical dialogue, where Thomas is saying that Ansels aren't much regarded in Astro because they have no golden life to go back to, like we've heard that the humans do. On any given day, you could just go back there and be well fed and well clothed and so on. And it's almost as if utopian cities are almost, whilst they're policing, they're also like solicitous that those who have left would come back, but they're not that way toward the Ansels. The Ansels just kind of don't count to the utopians. But when Thomas says this, Rimrock is like, no, actually, I do have a so-called golden life I could go back to in the ocean. And I find this really fascinating, but a little confusing. Rimrock tells Thomas that the ocean depths also have a sort of perfection, he uses that word, that he willingly left to come to Cathead, like these other people, like the humans. And, Thomas is baffled. He's like, well, it seems like it'd be like total freedom there in the ocean. Why would you leave that? Why would you trade that for Cathead, for the slavery and misery of Cathead, as he says? And Rimrock launches into this sort of disquisition. No, Thomas, the life in the ocean depths is very like the life of Golden Astrobe, too much like it. I lose my identity there. I am one of the school, and my mind is merged into the school mind. I never regretted becoming a man. I never regretted becoming a Cathead man. But you set me too low when you imply that I haven't given anything up. I've given up as much as any of them. Though, of course, there was a certain ignominy in being taken and eaten for a fish, which might have happened to me in my former state. And of course, back in chapter 4, I think, we saw this sort of like myth of the somewhat sudden evolution of the Ansels from a non-human sea creature into a human-like, I won't say level, I'll say form of sentience, presumably in some kind of response to the human colonizers coming to the planet, which is one of the mysteries of the novels that I'd love to, I don't know that you can ever unravel it, but I'd love to understand better at some point. And I get that Lafferty is very obviously, likening this utopia that he's painting to being part of a school mind, group think. And the individuality is lost in a corporate identity, a corporate mentality. And I think that's one of the philosophical positions I do sympathize with Lafferty about. And I think that you can be critical of that kind of group entity, group identity, group thinking without being a pure atomistic individualist. And I'm not sure exactly where Lafferty is on that spectrum, but I don't think he is that. I think he's very much about community and stuff. I don't know if I agree with his idea of community depending, but yeah, it's not as simple as like just a pure individualism that he's advocating for instead of that. But I'm a little surprised that he would, kind of malign non-human life in that way, which doesn't seem akin to a lot of what he does elsewhere in his fiction. Again, there's some mention of this in the story Snuffles, but especially in the story Animal Fair, which was published in 1974. And there's an interesting companion piece to it published the same year called And Name My Name, that deals with animals, non-human animals, and humanity's place among them. And again, I think Serpent's Egg really develops these ideas. Let me say this. Here's what I think. I really, really think this novel is the perfect debut novel because it's programmatic. It really sets out what Lafferty is concerned about and what he's kind of going to do with the rest of his novels one way or another. And to that degree, I'm happy that it's the one that the Library of America has put out. It might be the only one that they ever put out. It might be the only one it might be the single novel that mainstream fans are ever, mainstream readers are ever going to encounter from Lafferty. And in that sense, it's useful in that way. But if you don't go on to see where he takes the program from there and how he develops it and how he changes, I think, some things, that's a real shame, because I think this novel would be misleading as to some of his positions about things, in this case, like non-humans. Also, I think with technology and robots and AI and stuff, I think he fruitfully develops that in Arrive at Easter Wine and other places, and again, including Serpent's Egg. So I really wish I knew of a way to advocate for one or two, at least, other novels of his to get equal time with Past Master. And it'd be hard to decide which ones. And I don't think it'd be some of the ones that are already maybe closest to that, like Fourth Mansions. Great of a novel as it is, it's going to only confuse things more and not develop enough things, I think. That said, whilst he develops some things in later novels fruitfully, I think he also gets ideologically worse about some stuff, or more open about some stuff that's like counterbalances that. And so you get this really mixed bag, and it's kind of a bummer. It's like, oh, you really brought things, from my perspective, forward here, and then you took some major steps backward. There you go. That's Lafferty. That's what you're gonna encounter in Lafferty. I might say some more. I'll definitely say some more about that in future videos and confront some of this stuff very head on. I might have a little more to say about it in this video. But yeah, even if you take, let's say you do think either that the oceanic existence in schools and stuff is like a group existence, and that that's say inappropriate for like human existence, or it's just different from it, or even if you want to go so far as to say human consciousness and so on is better than that, to liken that state to the socially engineered and constructed on ideological lines utopia that creates that situation socially, just does not seem like a good analogy to me at all. I don't know. Maybe it's better than I think it is in certain ways. But at the moment, that's kind of sticking as a thorn in my mind there, going like, no, that doesn't work. It's a fun little point he's making about school mind, but tying it so directly to this beautiful character that is such a representation of ecology in the novel, and he really is, and of evolution and the wonder of evolution. It's quite explicit in the novel. And then suddenly going, yeah, group mind is like utopia, oceanic school mind like what they're doing over in that utopia. You got to escape that. It's like, wait, no, this is, what are we talking about? I'm just not totally sure it works. Let me know what you think. So Thomas departs frustrated from, as they're called, the hardheads of Cathead. And it says, they had been offered happiness on a platter again and again, and they had rejected it for misery. They were killing themselves for no point at all, or for a childish point. And they were poisoning and destroying a whole world with their madness. They had to be exterminated, like the rats that they refused to exterminate. Nevertheless, even though that's what Thomas is thinking, it says that he was the doctor, and the sickness made a strange, insane appeal to him to let it live and let the host die. Which, of course, factors into what I've been discovering as I go here about this is a counter-eating monster eating up the monster of nothingness. And he's tempted to let it have its way in that sense. And then there's another little tiny set piece here that I just think is beautiful. It just like switches scene and says, or it just kind of inserts this here. A poor woman reached out and touched Thomas as he walked in a muddy lane in the outskirts of Cathead. You will be king for 9 days. Then you will die, she whispered. She was crying softly. Make me no Salvator, you witch, he grumbled. I'll have naught to do with the high fate business. I just think that's a gorgeous little scene, and the whispering and the crying and the obvious sort of little allusions to like New Testament scenes with Jesus and, people touching Jesus, anointing him for his burial, women in particular doing these things. And it's just lovely and interesting. And so finally we come to the final main scene, but the penultimate scene of the chapter, in which he meets the Pope of Astrobe. It says he comes to a small medieval castle dwarfed by the giant shanty tenements. And you just get this lovely little kind of poignant scene. There's this really skinny old black man, as in like African man, basically on his deathbed. And he kind of speaks some Latin to him, which translates to a mass for the saints, Thomas More and John Fisher, who both were beheaded for being true to, I guess, papal authority or something along those lines, which is very important to Lafferty because it's about kind of keeping Catholicism's authority centered in Rome rather than in various sorts of kings who wanted like equal power and so on. And there's politics and theology and so on going on there. And I was really struck. It just so happens that I was reading and making notes for this chapter as the most recent pope died, and there's this question of who will be pope next, and out comes this film. I mean, I don't know how long it's been out, but I just saw it, but it's recent-ish, conclave about the issue of the Pope dying and who will succeed him and the issues around that. So, right where you might find Lafferty the most, irrelevant to your everyday life, if you're not a Catholic or whatever, or don't care about these things, these are things happening in the world that a lot of people very much care about and that still affect our culture and massively, really, to be honest. So Lafferty's on a certain important pulse of culture here back in 68 that was important then and before and continues to be, wherever you're at on the ideological spectrum. This is part of what the world's all about. And they reiterate this conversation that was at the beginning of the previous chapter about, and in fact was also brought up before that. So I think it's at least 3 times it's brought up specifically in this novel of, the church was given a promise by Christ that it will never pass away, particularly the Roman Catholic Church. And they're wondering, does this even apply on some other planet here, Astrobe? And furthermore, when it seems to have dwindled down to just a few people following it, surely these people will die off and it will just be no more, And so there's 2 questions. Does it apply on another planet? And will you'll just finally have no followers and be no more? And various people argue, including the Pope, that no, we were given the promise, it will last, and it's going to start growing again, even from these tiny few people. It's revealed maybe there's a couple hundred followers at this point on this planet. And yes, I knew that I was maybe going to confront what I think of as deeply problematic in Lafferty. One of one of the things, just a little bit head on here. Because one of the things that the Pope here says is that the promise, quote, was given to us here on Astrobe in these latter days, given in a queerer and more flaming way than you could imagine. Know you that Christ has walked on Astrobe in human form, in the company of St. Klingensmith and others. Know you that the burning promise was given, and the flame begins to rise. Now, a couple things here. St. Klingensmith is the green robe, the monk, who was also a black man that we've encountered earlier, is of the order of St. Klingensmith. So that's the reference here. And this statement here connects strongly to a story that came out a little later in 1972 or 3 called "And Walk Now Gently Through the Fire." And if you followed the channel for a while, you know that that's one of my favorite stories. And I used to write a blog that's based on language from that story. The blog was called "The Ants of God Are Queer Fish," because Lafferty likens Christians basically in that story to an alleged alien species called the queer fish, or also called the ants of God, because of their building proclivities in a society that's all about destruction, and construction is looked at as out and out illegal. And again, it's one of these, to me, kind of like ideological, massive overreactions to movements in society that Lafferty didn't like, and yet has a certain potency to it and really a beauty to it. It's in certain respects a beautifully written story, and I think there's some things that can be recovered from it, pulled out and made good use of, despite, I think, some overreactionary qualities as well. And in that story, it uses that language of queer for the Christians, and also the flame imagery. It ends in this big picture of like a spiritual flame growing. And so when I think he's referring to similar things here, talking about the promise being given again on this planet so that they know it applies to them as a planet, but in a queerer and more flaming way. And also that story talks about Christ walking amongst humans from time to time in history, which I don't know where that comes from. Is that a theological tradition? Is that a Lafferty thing? Let me know if you know. But all those pieces are here in this statement, and then again in that story. So it's an interesting companion piece in that way, and others with Past Master. But I know that Lafferty is aware of queer as a term that was originally a slur towards gay people, that then they took on themselves and kind of reappropriated it. And it's kind of one of the main terms now, queer theory and so on. And it's as if early on in that, Lafferty were trying to reappropriate it back into some kind of Christian term for the oddity of Christians going against the flow of certain things. And also, actually, I would love to do at some point a queer theory reading of Lafferty, because he does interesting things with gender and stuff, despite what I think is, as I'll say here in a second, some blatant homophobia. But what's fascinating is, queer theory has more than just to do with being quote unquote homosexual. It kind of branches into what queerness could mean more generally, and the way it speaks to the strangeness, the weirdness of, existence, of ontology and so on. And Lafferty seems to be using it in that way. But also when he uses the term flaming, I think he's also drawing on, terms that were used as slurs towards gay people that then maybe to one degree or the other they have used. I'm not totally sure about that. Certainly I've seen some of that. Now there are many amongst Christians, including Catholics, who have come to embrace queerness, both in themselves and in others, and want to make that a part of the church, the Catholic Church or otherwise, and who make very rigorous, careful, academic and otherwise, scriptural and theological cases for why that's actually the way it should be and the way it always should have been. Christian-inspired homophobia was based on misreadings of the Bible and theology and misunderstandings of it. That's the argument they would make. Okay, yeah, that's going on. That's, for some people a debate or whatever. And I think that Lafferty's language could be drawn into that against Lafferty's own wishes, admittedly. And I think we'd have to understand what Lafferty's doing first before we then tried to make that move. But I guess I just want to say here, I'm just going to try to grasp that nettle, bite that bullet, and admit, as far as I can tell, and I think it's, it's very, I would have to go find there's a moment here and there in like a short story or something. And then as when I spoke with Andrew Ferguson, a Lafferty scholar who's writing Lafferty's biography, this new book that's coming out from Cathead Press called In a Green Tree. Apparently he has some blatant homophobia in there. I'm calling it homophobia, stances against queerness. And well, okay, so what I was going to say is that I think reading Lafferty and Lafferty studies are worthwhile, even in spite of that and maybe a couple of other really, really problematic attitudes in Lafferty, to say the least. I mean, I find homophobia and stances against queerness I find them reprehensible, abhorrent. I mean, I don't want to necessarily say that about people who hold to them, but I think it's a extremely unhealthy and harmful point of view. And I realize, apparently the whole world is really divided on that. But that's where I stand with it. I'm not trying to just like write off whole groups of people or what have you, but the lines are being drawn, whether anybody wants them to be or not, and that's where I stand on that side of that line, and it's personal to me as well. But even if it weren't, that's where I stand, and I think there's various ways to critically read Lafferty in that regard, and like I said, I think sometimes he is doing a bit of queer theory in the way he does gender in his fiction. But also I think he has a lot of the misunderstandings that people have about this kind of stuff that leads to fears and hatred and sort of demonizing because you don't really understand what you're talking about, would be my point of view. And I think Lafferty displays some of that, and there's really, to me, gross equivalences with, that people make with, queerness and, quote unquote, sexual deviance, which, might be a right way to talk about, but certainly, wrong things done sexually, such as pedophilia. And I think there are hints of that. That maybe is not so explicit in Lafferty, but, it does seem that he, especially when he thinks of priests, certain priests, that, there's a tying together of those things that I don't think is legitimate at all, that he makes, and I think is based on misunderstandings. But I think, as with authors like Lovecraft, and I don't know who all else, there's plenty, unfortunately, people have reprehensible views that come out in their personal lives and in their fiction that we can potentially still study and benefit from studying their fiction. And I think Lafferty is one of those people, partly because, you need to critique that stuff, and partly because in his case, I think there's a lot of better angels in there as well. But as I've said before, I don't think anybody needs to. I want to, and I think it's legitimate to do so. But, if in the same way that you don't want to read Lovecraft because that's there, and you don't want to read Lafferty because that's there, by all means, don't. There's no need to read Lafferty or anyone else. Now, having said that, in a way it's more than I want to say, because I don't want to give a wrong impression, because it doesn't come up, some of Lafferty's most problematic attitudes, you could read a lot of his fiction and not really run into it. Although some things are definitely kind of always under the surface. although his stance about queerness, I'm not sure really is. I don't think it is as much as other sorts of problematic attitudes. Whereas I think some of the bigotry and so on in Lovecraft is actually more prominent. That said, a complication there is that some of Lafferty's potentially problematic attitudes are so under the surface that they're a little more insidious in that way. They can kind of do their work on the reader before the reader realizes what's happening. So sometimes it's better to have it more on the surface. Yada, yada. It's complicated. But I think this language here, I didn't have to bring it up, but I think it's good to just grasp that nettle. And he is really blatantly borrowing language from the gay community here. But again, to reiterate, and I'm just going to say this really baldly, and I mean this with love. I think I can say this with love, although it won't. People may disagree, but fuck you if you think this is virtue signaling. But I want to reiterate that I stand with trans people and trans rights. And by fuck you, I don't mean you just as a person writing you off, but that attitude that thinks that's somehow some kind of virtue signaling or going along with something. I mean, that's a pretty unpopular opinion these days. So I'm not getting any benefit from taking that position. It is my position. It's a principled position. And I think it's important to state that and to, use whatever influence we have to state that. And I have basically no influence. This is like one of the tiniest channels there is. But to the degree that people watch it, I think it's important at this juncture for me to say that. So again, in their conversation here, this Pope, reiterates that the faith is going to grow. The very stones and clods of Astrobe will sing of the promise to you, he says. And Thomas is just like, no, it's all finished. And the Pope is like, no, it's never finished. It's never hopeless. And I don't know that this conversation adds much to what's already been said and argued about this in the novel, but it does add an element of pathos to it that is interesting to me. That said, I do think right at this point, it feels so Catholic oriented that I'm not sure how inviting it would seem to outsiders. Let me know what you think if you are not from that perspective. And I have to admit, quite apart from all that stuff I just said about queer and all that, that's like really a separate issue. But right at this point in the novel I'm like drawn into how nice this scene is novelistically and emotionally in a sense. But I'm also feeling a little bit of religious fatigue with Lafferty in this novel at this point, which makes me understand why others who are far less interested, I'm interested in religion and theology, and people who just aren't at all or far less than me get fed up with this novel a bit in that regard. And, it really helps me understand that. I'm like, wow, if I feel a little fatigued at this point, imagine how others feel. Now, I don't know why that is, and I would have to examine that some more to kind of figure out, because it's not sheer quantity. Because a book like Arrive at Easter Wine, I would say, has a much greater quantity of religious imagery and discourse in it, but it comes at it in a way that adds layer after layer after layer and is just really rich and interesting and full of symbols. And maybe it's that there's an ambivalence there, or not an ambiguity, a fruitful sort of ambiguity that invites, thought and participation. Whereas here it feels, some of this religious discourse just comes in kind of hard, and doesn't have that supple quality that invites thought and participation, but it kind of keeps drawing these hard lines. Maybe that's a little why I'm fatigued at this point with the religious aspect. That said, I still don't think it's like overwhelming in this novel, and there's just so much else going on. And I think a lot of people just almost miss this kind of stuff altogether, or see it as sort of addressing sort of a, decoration on it. It's not, it's, central to it, but yeah, I think it's worth noting that it's hitting me that way even a little bit at this point. Nevertheless, I do like this scene, and it's kind of fitting after just tonally with the intensity of the rest of the chapter. It's a nice counterpoint in that way. And also shows that Lafferty's portrayal of, what he sees as sort of resistance to utopia and stuff isn't all about that intense over the top, we have to suffer the worst just to counteract that. There's gentler sort of feels and movements vibes going on, as well. And so lastly, the Pope says, turn God and bring us to life again. And the Pope and Thomas go back and forth with a little liturgy here of turn God and bring us to life again. And Thomas replies, and thy people rejoice in thee. And it's, in the right context, I find that language kind of beautiful and meaningful, even if I'm not necessarily that faith per se at this point in my life. I'll never be less than adjacent to it. And for those who have that faith, are of that faith, I can see it, being beautiful in the right context, if it means good things and not a bunch of, oppressive stuff. And Thomas just goes, so that's the last of them. It ends here, And I think, it's pretty obvious, that it's not going to end there. But of course, there's an irony there from Lafferty's perspective. So this closing bit is well worth reading. Sea gleaners were just bringing in a scow load of Dutch fish to be ground for fish meal. It was not really brutal work by Cathead standards, but it was plague day and 3 of the men had died. The scow-master stripped them of their boots. Dead men's boots are lucky, and there is a regular market for them. And then rolled the 3 bodies in with the Dutch fish. He buried them in with the fish, but half-heartedly, not caring much. The buyer came onto the scow, surveyed the take, and saw a leg sticking out in the outlines of all 3 bodies. "We'll weigh them along with the fish and take them," he said. "But I'll have to dock you a stoyman off detain for each body. They just aren't up to the fish in phosphor and sulfur, and they are hard on the grinders." And that's a coin of the place mentioned there. But, that's just such a good scene. Just grotesquely beautiful and poignant, and just so vivid. And just that last little sting of, like just their casualness about it. And it's like, they're hard on the grinders. And I just think that's rich with metaphor for the whole point of this novel. And there you go. That's Black Cathead. And we're finally going to get back onto the real political machinations of this novel and, polity and policy, with a few more really fantastic surprises of strangeness that come up in it all. And I guess just in case here, I'll mention, in case you've been wondering, you may have noticed I have a new tattoo here. I'll show it to you. I don't know if I can get a good shot of it here. All the sunlight pouring through. I'm trying to get it where I think that's too blown out. Okay, so we'll just do it sideways. This is how we'll have to do it. Let's see. Here's one side of it. And the word there is Cthulhucine or Cthulhucine or Thulucine, however you want to say it. I'll let you look it up. It is spelled differently than Lovecraft's Cthulhu because the woman who came up with it, Donna Haraway, wanted to distance herself from Lovecraft and, his misogyny and racism and so on. And maybe I'll talk about it another time. And I have mentioned it a little bit before on this channel. But just so you just weren't wondering, what the hell is that? And it's meant to be like sort of earth monstrosity in a generative sense, not just pure horror. And like sort of ecophobia. It's what I call the eco-monstrous, which equates to something more complicated than just, ooh, nature is scary. Maybe we'll talk about that another time. Anyway, stay tuned for the next chapters coming up on Past Master and some other stuff. And thanks for watching. Webbing is torn, some black galactic thing is born. When will the star children start? The astral call is clawed apart. Helical passion and ashen